Hi everybody, welcome to another makeover. And in today's video, I'm facing an interesting challenge to transform this mid-century modern stereo cabinet into a perfect entryway cabinet. And of course, there is a story behind. Some people came to see in person one of the pieces of furniture I had refinished. They were looking at an entryway cabinet and they were so picky about this one. It's too wide, no, it's too narrow. It's too low, no, it's too high. It's too large, no, it's too small. They left without buying anything, but I was like, challenge accepted. So let's see what we got here first. The whole system wasn't in the working condition. It might have been fixable, but it would be pretty expensive. And I don't have enough skills anyways. The cabinet itself was in pretty good shape except for the multiple scratches on the top. But I definitely can fix it. So I made a list of what makes a basic regular entryway cabinet to be a perfect entryway cabinet. It's supposed to have a glove box, trinket box, box for scarves and toques, extra room for shoes, room to put extra slippers. Yes, that's right, slippers are important. I started with removing the whole stereo system out of the cabinet, and I can tell that wasn't easy at all. Lots of hidden screws were holding the parts together, tons of wires. I think it took me about 3 hours to remove the whole thing. And no, I didn't throw it away. I posted on Facebook Marketplace for free, and in 1 hour it was gone. Once I was done with the stereo, I had a million of staples. Those staples were holding the insulation inside of the cabinet, and they were literally everywhere. Half an hour later, I was done with all of the staples. I vacuumed the piece, and there goes the missing footage here. The footage of what I'm going to build inside the piece. But anyways, I will try to explain it to you with my nice drawings. So here is my cabinet free from stereo system. Let's see the left bottom part closer. In that section, the right side was partially open and leading pretty much to nowhere. And there were some random wooden planks glued to the bottom of this section, so it wasn't flat. My plan was to build something like a box to cover the bottom and also to add the board to this side of the section. And this section will be my shoe storage. This is the right section, and here the left side was partially open. The bottom was flat except for those triangle pieces holding the bottom and the side. So the plan was to build some type of box to cover those triangles, and I was gonna build a shelf. The side I was gonna keep open for the additional storage. This part can be used for slippers. This is the top section where the record player and radio were at the first place. It was divided in two sides and the backboard on both sides was missing. The left side again was divided in two sections. The first section was the perfect glove box. All I needed was to build a trinket box above that glove box. The right side was pretty much done. All I needed to add the backboard. And that would be my box for scarves and toques. And there we go. I started implementing my plan by measuring and cutting all the boards I needed. And between the moment I started this process and the moment I completed it, a lot of things have happened. We found our dream property, then we sold the house we were living in, bought a new house, then we were packing and moving. And that's the main reason why I haven't been posting any videos in a while. After we got moved, our garage was cluttered and I couldn't work. So that's the second reason. And the third reason, I went back home to Belarus and I posted a video about it. My mom had no idea I was coming. I surprised her on her birthday. But finally I'm back and I'm ready to film and post my new videos. So there we go, all my boards are cut and I'm ready to build the boxes. I started with a small box for the right section that was supposed to cover the triangle blocks. To build that box, I'm using the simple pocket holes jig. I don't build a lot of furniture or cabinets, so that little guy works for me perfectly. I'd lie if I said that everything went smooth. One of my cuts wasn't straight on this board and I had to build up the height. To do that, I used an epoxy glue from dollar store and thin piece of wood I happen to have in my wood stash. While this box was drying, I started building the second box for the left section that was supposed to cover the bottom. I used the same pocket holes jig and I also used some epoxy glue to prevent the boards from moving while I'm screwing them together. The box are built and now it's time to start working with the body. And the first step to give this piece a good clean. By that time, I haven't decided what I'm doing here. I was thinking about restoring the top and the middle of the cabinet and paint the sides and the sliding doors. I would love to restore the whole piece, but it was impossible to take out the sliding doors that were built inside of the cabinet. And the other thing, while I was cleaning the cabinet, I noticed that the top coat looked kind of plasticky, like it was a polyurethane or something, and I knew that I was gonna have a hard time trying to remove it. So I started working with the top first. I used my favorite chemical stripper. It was sitting on the top for about 30 minutes and it didn't work. I tried to use the methyl hydrate next. It worked for me on some pieces before, and I thought maybe it will work here. With other pieces, methyl hydrate didn't remove the top coat, but it softened it and I was able to scrape it. Unfortunately, not in this case. I tried to scrape the piece, and in some areas I was able to scrape some poly off, but they were just small sections. It didn't work. One other option to be used was a heat gun, but I didn't use it because I worked with veneer. I was risking to damage veneer. Maybe there are some people who can work carefully with a heat gun and remove the top coat, but I'm not that type of person. So my only option was sanding. I mean, not just sanding, but lots of sanding. I started with 120 grit sandpaper and went up to 180. The biggest pain was to sand those sides, the skirt around the top, but thankfully it was made out of solid wood, so I was able to sand it as much as possible with my orbital sander, and of course lots of hand sanding. I was able to remove the top coat almost everywhere, except from the corners. I was kind of exhausted from sanding, so I decided to leave it as is and think about it later. On the top, I had this one little spot. It was lighter than the whole surface, so I decided to use an oxalic acid to try to lighten up the color of the top. I applied oxalic acid to the whole top and I left it to dry. Meanwhile, the epoxy glue I used for my boxes has hardened. First, I sanded the little box with 180 grit sandpaper. Then I moved on to the bigger box and I put some screws into the pocket holes. On the front part of the boards there were some dents, so I filled them up with the wood filler and I left them to dry. While wood filler is drying, I'm sanding the board I'm going to use for the shelvings, and also I'm sanding the board I'm going to cover one of the sides in this section, in the left section. Oh, I forgot to mention that there was a hole in the right section of the cabinet. To cover that hole, I cut a square piece of plywood and I used some wood glue to glue it in place. That piece of plywood was sitting pretty tight, but there were some gaps still. To cover those gaps, I mixed some epoxy glue with the sawdust and I applied it to the gaps. Meanwhile, the oxalic acid completely dried and I rinsed it with some water. Did it help? Yes, it did a little bit, but that light spot was still visible. While the top was drying, I installed the boxes, and I'm sorry, while I was doing it, in the middle of the process, my camera died. I only have a footage of installation of the small box, but I did the same steps with the bigger box. I applied some epoxy glue and then I clamped the boxes to the piece and I left them harden. Meanwhile, the top was completely dry and I did finishing sanding with 220 grit. Because I was working with a really thin layer of the veneer, I made those pencil marks to guide myself while sanding. Those marks helped me to know that I already have sanded in this area and I can move on to the next one. Once I was done with the top, I scuff sanded the whole piece. After spending hours of removing the old finish from the top, I decided to paint the rest of the piece instead of keeping the middle part wooden. I found lots of dents inside and outside of the cabinet and I filled them up with the wood filler. While the wood filler was drying, I flipped the piece on its back to remove the legs and the baseboard. Remembering those people's comments I told you about at the beginning, I was thinking about making this cabinet a little bit taller. But two things made me to change my mind. The first one is, with this height, the existing height of the cabinet, the person who's ever gonna buy this cabinet would be able to sit on it. In my opinion, it is a huge advantage to be able to sit while putting your shoes on. And the second thing, the legs, they were made out of solid walnut, which doesn't happen often. They were so beautiful, so I decided to keep them. Oh, and there was the third reason. I removed the old screws that were holding the baseboard, but it was glued to the base pretty good. It was just sitting there and I wasn't able to remove it. I mean, I was able. I could have used some hot water and tried to melt the glue or a heat gun, but I thought that it wasn't worth it. And I was gonna keep the legs anyway, so what's the point? The finish on that baseboard was in pretty good shape, but I decided to refresh it using Restore Finish. I don't use this product very often since I discovered the ingredients of it. It is pretty much the mix of some solvents and spirits with some toner added, and it dissolves the top layer of your finish, but in this case I wasn't worried because the top coat was pretty thick. The legs I sanded using the drill and going up with a grid from 120 to 220. By that time, the wood filler has dried and I sanded it smooth by hand. This is the top section where the radio was placed and it's supposed to be my trinket box. So here goes the fun part again. The plan was to put this shelf inside and then to cover the back side with the board. That's how it looks from the inside. There were 2 stoppers that were holding the radio and all I needed to add 2 more stoppers at the back. To glue the stoppers to the side, I'm using CA glue with an activator. As you can see here, I added the backboard and I think I screwed up with measurements. I obviously did because there was a gap. I didn't want to redo the whole thing because it was already glued. So instead, to fill up the gap, I'm using Bonda. 2 hours later, and there we go, my trinket box is ready. And here's my scarves and tube box, but I'm gonna be adding the backboard later. I scuff sanded the all inside of camera and finally I was ready to paint. I'm in to prime first. I'm using Kiehl's Restoration Interior Primer, and on the jar it says that it works as good as shellac bin primer. Once my primer dried, I filled up some gaps here and there. I intentionally didn't fill up those gaps before because first I was going to use some caulking and the second it was easier for me to use caulking on the prime piece because I can see those gaps better. Once my caulking dried, I applied a second coat of primer. I don't usually do that, but in this case, I guess I just wanted to be sure. After the second coat of primer dried, I lightly sanded the whole piece with 400 grit sandpaper. And then I started painting. I hit on head furniture paint in this dark beige color. I didn't really like it, but it was last jar on sale and it was pretty good deal, so I took it. But I imagined this piece in a lighter color, so I mixed together this beige color with leftovers of white paint. I applied the first coat of the paint and then I left it to dry for about a month. I'm not lying, I was actually so in rush and I wanted to post this video before I went to Belarus, but it didn't happen. So my first coat was definitely and completely dry and ready for the second one. Once I was done with the second coat, I left it to dry and moved on to the legs and the backboards. To seal the legs, I used leftovers of my Otis oil. I applied it, I let it sit for about 1 hour and then I buffed it. The box I built was a little bit shorter than I needed and it didn't cover the back a triangle block, so I was planning to put there the baseboard. But once I installed the box, the baseboard didn't fit in there. I couldn't put it in there without breaking. So I had to come up with a different plan. And while I was thinking about it, I decided to finish my shelf. In order for the shelf to fit inside of the left section, I needed to cut off the little piece from one of the edges. And then I applied my water-based bear stain in the color Special Walnut. And while I was working with the shelf, I kept looking on these parts I was gonna throw away. And then I was like, what if I use them as backboards for my sections? It turned out that they perfectly fitted the back sides of my right and left sections. For the left side, I was going to use the whole thing, but for the right side, I already had the backboard. And if you remember, I needed to add the additional baseboard to cover the wooden block, the triangle block at the back. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it will once you see it. So for the right side, I needed just the fabric. So here's my additional baseboard and I needed a half of the fabric to cover this. To keep the fabric in place, I decided to use the CA glue with the activator. I applied the glue to the board, then covered it with the fabric and then sprayed with an activator over it. And the edges on the other side I fixed with a staple gun. So here's the original baseboard that was covering the right side of the cabinet. First, I sanded it smooth with 180 and with 220 grit sandpaper. Then the other half of the fabric I glued to the top of this board. I used the same CA glue and I also fixed it in place with a staple gun. The left side of the cabinet I was going to cover with this whole thing, but it was a little bit longer than the cabinet was. All I needed was just undo the fabric at the edge, cut it shorter, and that put the fabric back. You're probably so confused now, but I promise I'm almost done and it all will make sense at the end. I just needed one additional board for this part of the cabinet. I measured and cut this board, sanded it, and painted the same color. Before starting working with the top, I wanted to refresh those wooden parts inside of the cabinet. And here again, I'm using Restore Refinish because the top coat is pretty thick, so I have nothing to worry about. And I also have some paint here and there on the surface, and Restore Refinish will help me to get rid of it. And finally, I was ready to work with the top, but I noticed that I left some stains from the Restore Finish on my gloves here and there on the top. And because Restore Finish has a toner in there, it penetrated into the surface and I couldn't get rid of those stains without sanding the whole top. So I decided just to apply Restore Finish. It wouldn't do anything to the top except changing the color a little bit. And you know what? At the end, I really liked how it turned out. And it also gave me a possibility to mask the spots where I burned through the veneer. To do that, I'm using the furniture paint markers from Home Depot. And I also used the same markers to blend in the lighter spot I had on the surface. Before applying the top coat, I decided to put the whole cabinet together. I started with the right side of the cabinet and first goes this baseboard. To keep it in place, I applied some CA glue at the edge and then I put the baseboard inside of the cabinet. Right here. So this way I covered that triangle block in the back. And for an additional support, I added 2 stoppers here, one on the bottom and one on the side. And here again, I'm using the CA glue with the activator. The next step, I'm putting the original baseboard back to its place, right here. And now I hope it makes perfect sense. And if you notice, there is the space above that board, right here. That's what I built my last board for. There was an original baseboard for that part somewhere, but it got lost while we were moving. Then I added the left section and moved on to the top. For the top coat, I used Rubio Monocoat. It's an oil with an activator. I mixed together 3 parts of the oil and 1 part of the activator and applied it to the top. I like to apply Rubio Monocoat using an old credit card, and after that, I like to spread it with the white non-abrasive pad. And I also applied Rubio to my shell. And the very important step you don't want to miss is to wipe off an excess of the oil after 15 minutes. Again, it's very important because if you don't do this, the excess will cure and you're not going to have a smooth surface. I left Rubio to cure for 24 hours. The full curing time is 7 days, but in 24 hours you can gently use the piece. And we're almost done here. I flipped the dresser and I put back the legs. And then I put my shelf inside. To hold the shelf, I decided to use some wooden blocks. I know, there is probably a better solution for this, but the back side of the shelf was placed on top of the backboard. If I had to put 4 holders, I would have just used the guide and I screwed 4 holes and I put those little pretty holders. But here I was afraid to mess up, so I did what I did. And it worked. And I bet you forgot that we still have the handle on top. Because I almost forgot. First, I wanted to use a spray paint, but I would have to cover the whole piece with paper or plastic film. But I was risking to have like a gold dust on the surface because I know a spray paint, it manages to get on the surface no matter how good you cover it. And the other thing, the tape didn't stick to the top. I know it looks like it did, but it didn't. So instead of spray paint, I decided to go with the Gillen wax. I used Gillen wax before and it always turns out great. And now we are finally done. Let me remind you how this piece looked before. And there we have it. A perfect entryway cabinet, in my opinion. Okay, maybe it's not completely perfect, but I love how it turned out. And you know what, looking at this piece right now, I'm thinking maybe I have to add some dark wax to it or like some type of glazing. I did it with my previous piece and it turned out that people didn't like it. But anyways, let me know what you think. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you guys for sticking with me, for watching and liking my video, for all of your support. It is really important for me. Thanks again and see you in my next video.